The prairie wind tasted of ash that morning, sharp, acrid, and heavy with a promise of ruin. Where the wagon train had once crawled westward like a determined insect, now only wreckage remained, torn canvas flapping in the wind, splintered wheels half buried in churned mud. And the bruised hush of the dead left where they fell. They should have known better than to linger near the shallow bend of Dry Creek. Word always traveled about the Painted Horse Gang, how they struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. But warnings meant little to people desperate enough to chase a patch of land they'd never see dot in the aftermath. The survivors were few. And among the few, there was only one who could not run. Her name was Sorella Callahan, but nobody had said her name out loud since the shooting started. She sat propped against the charred remains of a wagon, a hand pressed to the curve of her belly. The baby shifted under her palm, a stubborn flutter of life, in a place where death had taken everything else. She should have been crying, or screaming, or even praying. But grief had its own strange alchemy when blood dried stiff in your hair and the last face you loved lay, half buried by windblown grit. Grief turned to stone, and Sorella's tears turned to salt long before the first vulture's shadow crossed her boots. When the hoofbeats came, they came soft at first, a distant drumbeat that might have been another storm. But storms did not breathe, nor did they watch you from the saddle with eyes like obsidian and shoulders painted with the colors of the wind. The man who rode into the ruin that morning called himself Mato. In the Lakota tongue it meant bear, and when Sorella lifted her eyes to meet him, she understood why. His hair was bound with sinew and beads that caught the light like small prayers. He carried a long rifle across his back, but it was the old scar along his jaw-pale as a river of bone that marked him more deeply than any weapon ever could. Mato dismounted slow, like he did not wish to frighten her. She was too far gone to be afraid of men. If fear had come for her, it would have found her long before the last gunshot echoed off the bluffs. He said something in his language gentle, like wind in tall grass. She did not answer. Her throat felt made of dust. When he crouched, his shadow fell over her, blocking out the harsh glare of the noon sun. "Woman," he said in halting English, "where are your people?" Sorella's dry lips cracked as she forced a whisper past them. "Gone." He glanced past her, past the scorched wagons, the dead mules, the flies already swarming the wagon captain's chest. "You carry a child?" It felt like an accusation. She pressed her palm harder to her belly. "Yes," a long silence stretched between them. The prairie spoke in the hush of wind and the quiet moan of warped wheels. Mato's eyes moved to the horizon, where thunderheads threatened to break the world open. "Come," he said at last, extending a hand. It was scarred and calloused, strong enough to crack a man's spine, but soft as a promise as it hovered in front of her. "You die here, or you live. I protect you, I swear." She wanted to laugh. The sound got lost somewhere in her throat. "Why?" His mouth twitched a flicker of amusement that did not reach the iron in his gaze. "Because the wind does not choose where the seed falls, it just carries it." When she did not take his hand, he did not withdraw it. He waited motionless as stone until she found enough strength to lift her own. Her fingers trembled when they closed around his dot. The world tilted as he hoisted her to her feet. Pain rippled through her hips, her legs. Every step away from the massacre felt like a betrayal of those who could not stand again. They left Dry Creek behind them. The ghosts watched them go, eyes empty as bullet holes. And the wind rose carrying the scent of ash and hope in equal measure. Night fell like a blanket woven from every shadow that had ever touched Sorella's skin. They camped beneath the shelter of a sandstone bluff, the fire pit hidden by boulders and brush. Mato's horse grazed nearby, patient and unbothered by the scent of blood still crusted in the hem of Sorella's dress. She did not sleep. Sleep was for people who trusted tomorrow to come gently. Instead, she sat with her back against the bluff, her knees drawn up, a thin blanket draped around her shoulders. Mato sat across from her, sharpening a blade that looked older than the prairie itself. She studied him in silence. The lines of his face were carved deep by wind and time, older than she had first guessed, but not old enough to seem distant. He caught her watching and paused his work, one brow lifting. "You look like you have questions." "I have too many," she said hoarsely. "But they're heavy, and I don't have room to carry them tonight." Mato nodded as if he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe he carried questions too, ones that had no words in either of their tongues. When she shifted, a bolt of pain lanced through her lower back. She winced, curling her hand protectively over her belly. The baby stirred just a flutter, but enough to remind her that she was not alone in the prison of her skin. Mato watched, eyes narrowing. "Your time comes soon?" She forced a breath, past the knot in her chest. "I don't know. Maybe. I thought I'd have a wagon, a bed, a midwife." "Not." Her eyes flicked to the darkness beyond the fire's glow. "Not this." He said nothing. He set aside his knife, reached into a leather pouch, and drew out a handful of dried herbs. He crumbled them into a tin cup, poured hot water from the small kettle. The scent that rose sharp, earthy, reminded her of meadows she'd never see again. When he offered it, she hesitated. Mato tilted his head, patient as ever. "It helps pain and fear." She took it with both hands. The warmth bled into her fingers, into the deep ache that lived beneath her ribs. She drank, and the bitter taste chased some of the numbness from her tongue. "You have family?" she asked, voice muffled against the rim of the cup. His eyes drifted to the stars overhead. They glittered like distant eyes. Once. His nod was slight but final. The wind carried them. "Now it carries me." They sat in silence after that, two broken people, bound by the stubborn thread of a promise neither had asked for. The fire cracked and hissed. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to one another across the open plains. Sorella wrapped her arms tighter around her knees. "Will you really protect me?" Mato's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, even if it costs you everything." He looked at her, then really looked, and something like an echo of grief flickered through his eyes. "It already has. This is what remains. A promise kept." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the wind could change direction, that tomorrow might come wrapped in something softer than smoke and gunpowder. But deep down, she knew that some promises demanded everything a soul could bear and more. When the wind shifted near dawn, Sorella dreamed she heard voices carried on at her mother's, her father's, all those who lay dead along Dry Creek. They did not blame her. They did not forgive her. They simply waited. And so did she, sitting in the cold ashes of yesterday, her hand pressed to the fragile drumbeat of life that had survived the storm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The hush before dawn gave the world a brittle stillness, the kind that made every breath feel borrowed. Sorella's eyelids fluttered open before the first rays of sunlight touched the sandstone bluff. She shifted, careful not to wake Mato, who sat cross-legged with his back against a boulder, chin tucked to his chest in restless sleep. The embers had burned low, but a thin wisp of smoke rose from the heart of the fire pit. She shivered. Her old traveling coat, once fine blue wool lined with mother's careful stitches, was torn at the sleeve and crusted at the hem with dried blood. She tugged it tighter around her shoulders, hoping the baby could feel the warmth she could not find in her own bones. A low grunt made her flinch. Mato stirred, eyes snapping open as if they'd never really closed. He glanced at the fire, then at her. His voice was low, rough with sleep but steady. "Cold?" She gave a small nod. The truth was more complicated. She was cold, but she was also afraid of the memories curling at the edges of her mind, and of the ache beneath her ribs that pulsed with every shallow breath. Mato rose without another word. He stepped away from the camp, returning moments later with more kindling, a dead branch, splinters of sagebrush. He set to work feeding the fire, coaxing small flames to life. Sparks danced like fireflies in the half-light. Sorella studied his hands as he worked. They were broad and scarred, but each movement was deliberate, almost gentle. How could hands that had likely broken bones and loosed arrows into men's backs now build something so small and fragile as a fire for her? "Your dreams, Mato," said suddenly, not looking at her. "They troubled you." She stiffened. "How do you know?" His eyes flicked to hers, dark and still. "You speak in your sleep." She hugged her knees tighter. The words she remembered were tangled fragments, her mother's lullabies, her father's booming laugh before it turned to a gurgle in the dirt, the sound of her husband's voice. As he shouted her name the moment before the bullet found his throat, she forced herself to meet Mato's gaze. "I dream of Dry Creek, and of before. Dreams are just spirits reminding you you're still alive." He tossed another stick into the fire. The dead have nothing left to say. His certainty should have comforted her. Instead it scraped. Something raw inside her. She wanted the dead to speak. She wanted her mother's blessing, her father's forgiveness. She wanted her husband's promise that she'd done enough surviving when she could have laid down beside him. The fire crackled and spat resin. Sorella winced at a sudden jab of pain low in her belly. She sucked in a breath, pressing her palm to the swell beneath her coat. Mato's attention snapped to her. He moved closer, crouching so his eyes were level with hers. "The child?" She gritted her teeth as the pain ebbed. "It's early still." "I don't think." Another jolt silenced her protest. It felt like the prairie itself shifting beneath her bones. Mato stood abruptly. He went to his horse, rummaging through one of the worn saddlebags, and returned with a rolled blanket and a small pouch of dried roots. He poured water into the battered tin cup, dropping in a pinch of crushed herbs. "You drink," he ordered. "Helps with pain, helps make you strong." She took the cup in shaking hands. The bitter brew smelled of wet earth and something sharper, like a storm waiting to break. She sipped, feeling the warmth coil through her ribs and settle deep in. Her belly. Mato sat beside her, not touching, but close enough she could feel the heat of him. She wanted to tell him he could leave, that she'd be fine, that she didn't need a stranger's promise to bind her to this world when everything she loved was already gone. Instead, she whispered, "Why do this for me? You owe me nothing." He turned his head, studying her as if the question were carved into her bones. "In my village we say a woman who carries life carries the future of us all. To protect you is to protect tomorrow." She let out a shaky breath that might have been a laugh. "Tomorrow. I don't even know if I'll see the sun go down today." Mato reached out then, slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he rested his hand lightly on her forearm. His palm was warm, steady. It felt like an anchor when she had. "None. You will," he said simply. "You must." The morning broke clear, but cold. Mato helped her onto the horse, a sturdy paint gelding with patient eyes, and they rode west, keeping to the shelter of low draws and cottonwood stands, where the wind carried their scent away from the open plains. They spoke little. Sorella drifted in and out of a dazed half-sleep, lulled by the horse's gait and the low murmur of Mato's voice whenever he sensed her slipping too deep into darkness. He told her stories, not all in English, but the meaning wrapped itself around her like a threadbare quilt. He spoke of his mother, who taught him to track deer by the bend of broken grass, of his sister, who died during the last hard winter when food grew scarce and the soldiers burned their stores, of the spirit of the bear that watched over him when he took his name. The world blurred behind her eyelids. Faces came and went, some familiar, some born only of fever and fear. Each time she opened her eyes, Matu was still there, a dark shape, riding beside her, glancing back whenever her breath caught too sharply in her throat. They stopped near midday by a creek that cut through the prairie like a silver scar. Mato lifted her gently from the saddle, his arms careful as they bore her weight. When her legs buckled, he did not let her fall. He found a hollow where the grass grew thick and tall. There he built a small lean-to from bent willow branches and draped his blanket over it to block the worst of the wind. Sorella lay curled on her side, eyes half closed. Her hand never strayed far from her belly. The child within her seemed to sense the world had turned dangerous, kicking now and then like a fist against a locked door. Mata sat cross-legged outside the shelter, scanning the horizon with the unblinking stillness of a hawk. His rifle rested across his knees. When Sorella shifted, groaning at another sharp pain, he murmured something soft, a word she could not catch but that felt like a blessing. A sound reached them then, a distant echo that made the hair on the back of Sorella's neck rise. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, but many. Mata stiffened. His hand tightened on the rifle. He turned to her, his voice urgent but low. "Stay here, do not move, no sound." Fear clamped down on her throat. She reached for him, but he was already gone, melting into the tall grass like a ghost titched. From shadows, the hoofbeats drew closer. Sorella pressed a hand over her mouth, willing her breath to stay silent. Her heart drummed against her ribs like the beat of war drums she'd once heard at a trading post. Celebration, only this rhythm carried no promise of dance, only of blood. Through a slit in the lean-to, she glimpsed them. 3 riders, white. Men in tattered coats, rifles strapped to their saddles. Eyes sharp with the feral glint of men who'd learned the prairie's cruelty and decided to match it. Wagons hit back east. One said, spitting into the grass, "Bet there's pickings still. Maybe a pretty widow or two hiding like rabbits." Sorella's blood went cold. Her hand drifted to the small knife Mato had slipped into her palm that morning, more a gesture than a real defense, but it felt heavier now, its bone handle warm with her sweat. The men dismounted, spreading out, peering into every clump of grass and every hollow in the creek bank. One drew closer, boots crunching twigs just feet from where she lay. A voice cracked the silence like a whip. "Looking for something, white man." It was Mato. He stepped from the grass not 20 paces away, rifle held low but ready. He looked, carved from the same wind that bent the prairie grass, his presence so sudden it seemed impossible. The man froze, eyes flicking from Mato's rifle to the shadow of Sorella's lean-to. "Ain't none of your business, Redskin." Mato's expression did not change. He lifted the rifle half an inch, enough to make the threat plain. "This place is not yours to take from." The second man, older, with a scar splitting one eyebrow, laughed, but the sound was too brittle to carry true humor. "1 man against 3, maybe you're the fool here." The standoff stretched tight as rawhide. Sorella's breath snagged in her throat as the first man's hand drifted toward his holstered pistol. Mato shifted his stance. "Take your horses. Ride east. If I see you again, I put you in the earth." The third man, a boy, really, his cheeks raw from windburn, spoke. "Up. What's worth dying for out here, savage?" Sorella's fingers tightened on the knife's hilt. The baby kicked hard, as if to remind her that there was more than her life at stake. Mato did not move, did not blink. "You decide," he said simply. The older man weighed the distance, his eyes calculating. Sorella saw the moment he made his choice, how greed curdled to fear when he realized the risk outweighed the reward. "Come on," he snapped at the others. "Ain't worth the bullet." They backed away, spitting curses, climbing into their saddles with stiff, angry movements. One glanced back at Mato, eyes filled with the promise of trouble yet to come. But they rode on east, toward the sun that rose bloody behind them. When the sound of hooves faded, Mato lowered his rifle. He stood unmoving until he was sure the wind would not carry new riders to their camp. Only then did he kneel by Sorella's shelter, his eyes meeting hers through the small gap in the branches. "You are safe," he said, voice steady despite the storm in his eyes. "For now." Sorella's shoulders shook. The knife slipped from her fingers into the grass, but deep inside, she felt something stronger than fear rooting itself where grief had once made its home. The prairie was wide and cruel and full of teeth, but she would not face it alone. Not now, not ever. The prairie dawn bled into morning, slow and gray, washing the world in a thin light that made the shadows seem restless. Sorella sat beside the ashes of their fire, watching the wind chase scraps of smoke through the tangled grass. Her shoulders ached from a night of half-sleep, every heartbeat reminding her that her time was drawing closer than she could bear to think. Mato moved through camp with the same quiet purpose that had become her anchor. He tethered his horse to a low cottonwood, checked the saddle straps for wear, his eyes always shifting from the horizon back to her. Each time their eyes met, he gave her a small nod, steady as a promise that neither of them spoke aloud anymore. She pulled her coat tighter around her belly. The baby had grown restless, feet tapping at her ribs like a signal drum. Each flutter felt like a question she didn't know how to answer. "Drink," Mato said, kneeling to pour warm water into the battered tin cup. He handed it to her, and for a moment their hands touched her fingers, cold and trembling. His dry and steady. She forced herself to sip, though her stomach turned with every swallow. How much farther? He looked east, where the sun lifted itself from the rim of the world in reluctant streaks of red. 2 days, maybe 3. We find village before snow comes. The way he said it made her feel like he believed the snow was another enemy they could outwit if only they kept moving. She wanted to believe it too. "Is it safe?" she asked. "Your people, will they even want me there?" A shadow passed through his eyes, brief but sharp. "You carry child. They welcome you." She wasn't so sure. But she held her tongue because arguing felt like wasted breath when every word scraped raw across her throat. Mato knelt and began tying bundles, careful loops of rope around blankets and spare clothes. His rifle lay within reach, a silent sentinel that never slept. She studied the scar that split his jaw, white against the copper of his skin. She'd traced it once in her dreams, wondering what blade or bullet had marked him, what stories were stitched into the jagged line that caught the light whenever he turned his head. "Mato." He glanced up. "HM? Why do you care so much?" Her voice cracked under the weight of the question. "You could have left me there. Anyone else would have." His hands stilled. He seemed to consider his words as if each one cost him more than the next mile of hard prairie. "Once, someone found me when I should have died. Fed me, hid me from the soldiers. Saved me." He met her gaze fully then, his eyes unblinking. "That man said, 'One day you carry the same fire for another. This is my fire to carry.'" She wanted to weep at that, but the tears would not come. She settled for reaching out, brushing her fingertips against the sleeve of his coat. It was rough wool, worn smooth where the rifle strap rested. He didn't flinch at her touch, only dipped his head as if to tell her he understood what she could not say. They traveled that day through waist-high grass that hissed against the horse's flanks. Clouds gathered low, like a bruise smudged across the horizon. When the wind shifted, Sorella smelled snow and it a dry, metallic bite that made her throat close tight around her heartbeat. Her legs ached with every step. Mato walked beside the horse, one hand on the reins, the other never straying far from his knife. He moved with the patience of a man who knew the prairie's moods by the bend of the grass and the calls of distant birds. They crossed a narrow creek near midday. The water was low but swift, carving the earth into broken banks. Mato led the horse through first, boots sinking into the mud. Sorella clutched the saddle horn, trying not to let the cold seep into her bones. Halfway across, the baby shifted, sending a sharp pain up her spine. She gasped, almost slipping. Mato's hand shot up to steady her. "Easy," he murmured. "One step at a time." She wanted to curse him for his calm, for the way he made every impossible thing sound like something she could survive if she just held on long enough. But the words tangled behind her teeth. When they climbed the far bank, Mato scanned the plains behind them. A line of vultures circled high above the creek, a grim reminder of what waited for anyone left behind. "We keep moving," he said, voice flat as stone. "Too many ghosts in this place." By nightfall, they found a hollow sheltered by a ring of low hills. Dead cottonwoods leaned like crook old men, their branches rattling in the wind. Mato built a fire in a pit of stones, low and narrow, so its light wouldn't carry. Sorella sat with her knees drawn up, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She watched the flames lick at the wood, sparks spinning into the black. The baby shifted again, stronger this time, so strong she bit down on her lip to keep from crying out. Mato squatted beside her, his shadow long and thin in the firelight. "Pain worse?" She nodded. Sweat beaded on her upper lip despite the cold. "It's coming. I can feel it." He didn't tell her it would be all right. He didn't offer pretty lies. Instead, he stood, rummaging through his pack until he found the bundle of dried herbs and a length of clean cloth. He handed her a leather strap. "For your teeth," he said. "When the time comes." Her fingers closed around it like a lifeline. "You've done this before?" He hesitated. "No, but my mother did. Many times." The fire cracked, sending sparks into the dark. Sorella forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly. She focused on the rise and fall of Mato's shoulders as he sat near the edge of the camp, eyes fixed on the shadows shifting just beyond the circle of light. "Will you stay?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. He turned his head. Just enough for the fire to catch the curve of his jaw, the glint of his eyes. "Always." And somehow that single word made the shadows feel a fraction less sharp. When sleep finally took her, it came like a stone tossed into deep water, sudden and heavy. She dreamed of open hands reaching for her, of her mother's voice singing. In the half-light of a prairie unbroken by wagon ruts and blood, she woke with a start, a sharp cramp twisting low in her belly. Mato was at her side in an instant, the knife he'd been sharpening forgotten beside the fire. "It's time," she gasped, her nails digging into the blanket. "Mato, it's time." He nodded, calm as ever. He moved around her, adjusting the blankets, placing the leather strap in her palm. He spoke to her in Lakota, then words she didn't understand, but that felt like hands pressing her back when she wanted to bolt into the darkness and run until the pain let her go. She bit down hard when the next wave hit. The world narrowed to the fire's glow, the smell of wet earth, the rasp of Mato's voice in her ear. Each push felt like tearing herself open with her own hands. But every time she thought she'd slip into the dark and not come back, she felt Mato's fingers wrap around hers, steady and unyielding. "Breathe," he murmured. "You are stronger than the storm." Hours bled into one another. The fire hissed and popped. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled at the rising moon. Sorella's vision blurred until the stars overhead seemed to spin like lanterns hung from a sky she no longer trusted. Then, all at once, the world shifted. Pain gave way to something raw and bright, a sound tearing from her throat that did not belong to her, but to every woman who had ever brought life into a place meant only for death. A small, wet cry rose from the darkness. Mato's hands were gentle but sure as he wrapped the squirming bundle in a strip of clean cloth. He placed the child in her arms like an offering. Sorella stared at the baby's face, red and squashed and perfect. She felt a sob rise, then a laugh, then something that tasted of every prayer she thought she'd forgotten. "It's a girl," Mato said, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. "Strong like you." She looked at him, tears blurring. "The firelight. What do we call her?" Mato's eyes shone with something more than reflection. "Whatever name you carry to tomorrow." Sorella bent her head over her daughter, breathing in the scent of new life, raw, wild, and stubborn as the prairie wind that had tried and failed to bury them both. In that fragile hush, She felt something grow inside her chest, a fire of her own, fierce enough to light the way through the darkness yet to come. The cold bit deeper in the hours after the child's first cry. Sorella lay half-propped on Mato's rolled blanket, her daughter nestled against her chest. Each small breath the baby drew was a miracle so fragile it seemed it could be snatched away with the next wind that rattled the dead branches overhead. Mata crouched at the edge of the fire, feeding it careful pieces of wood stripped from a fallen cottonwood. His hands moved with the same quiet strength she had come to trust, a strength that built warmth when there was none and carved hope out of a night that had tried its best to break them. Sorella touched the baby's cheek with her thumb. The skin was impossibly soft, damp still from birth and the hurried wash with a rag warmed over the fire. Her daughter's eyes were closed, but her mouth worked silently, testing air she'd never known. "What name?" Mato asked. He did not look at her when he said it. His eyes stayed fixed on the fire, as if the answer was too holy to meet head-on. Sorella's throat was raw. She swallowed once, tasting the salt of tears that had dried on her lips hours ago. "Alba." Mato looked at her then. A single brow lifted in question. "It means dawn," she murmured. "When my mother was alive, she told me that every new dawn is a chance. I want her to carry that, even when I can't." Mato seemed to weigh the word on his tongue, testing its shape in his own language. Then he nodded. "Alba, good name." They sat in silence while the fire hissed and the wind whispered its cruel promises through the grass. The baby stirred, rooting blindly against Sorella's breast. She shifted her blanket, pressing the child closer, and a wave of pain rolled through her lower belly, sharp, insistent. She gasped. Mato was beside her in a heartbeat, the back of his knuckles brushing her cheek. "Pain is strong after birth," she panted. "It's normal. Just help me sit forward." He did. His hands on her shoulders were as careful as if she were spun glass. When the pain passed, she leaned her forehead against his chest, drawing in the scent of smoke, leather, and something beneath it, all that was just him, earth and bone and promise. They stayed like that until the baby fell back into sleep. Her tiny fists curled near her chin. Dawn came pale and flat, the sky washed in a color that made the world feel newly skinned. Mato packed their camp in silence, pausing only to hand Sorella sips of warm water steeped with the bitter roots he swore would keep her strong. Sorella held Alba against her shoulder, swaying slightly to soothe the fussing that came with each sudden gust of wind. The baby's cries were soft but insistent, proof of life that felt louder than any gunshot. When Mato lifted her onto the horse, she winced. Every muscle in her body ached like bruised fruit, and the saddle felt like a cruel joke after a night spent wrestling with death and birth. "Easy," Mato said, bracing her with one hand on her back. He adjusted the blanket around Alba's tiny head, tucking it beneath Sorella's chin. "Hold her close. Wind is sharp today." They set off again, following the line of a dry wash that twisted between low hills. The grass here was thinner, winter burnt to brittle gold. Overhead, clouds gathered in a slow, grim procession, their edges dark with the promise of snow. Sorell watched the sky, her mind turning circles around thoughts too big to hold. A new life in her arms, a man who had sworn to guard them both. A world that would just as soon chew their bones to splinters as give them shelter. Mato walked beside the horse, one hand on the reins, the other brushing the knife at his hip every so often, as if to remind the world that he would not yield. What was his to protect? By midday, the wind had stiffened. It howled across the prairie, lifting dust and grit until it scoured their faces raw. Alba fussed against Sorella's chest, her small cries muffled by the blanket. Mato halted them near a cluster of scrub and dry rock. He tied the horse to a low branch and crouched to build a small windbreak from stones and fallen limbs. "We rest here," he said. "She needs milk. You need food." Sorella's lips cracked when she smiled. "I don't have much milk yet." "You Will. He gave her a look that left no room for doubt. She settled herself behind the windbreak, bracing her back against a boulder. Alba latched onto her breast with a stubborn strength that made Sorella laugh through the ache. The sound startled her. How raw and alive it felt to hear her own laughter after so many days of nothing but grief's sharp edge. Matu returned with a handful of dried meat and 2 flasks of water. He set them down beside her but did not sit. His eyes scanned the horizon constantly, watching the gray wall of clouds that crawled closer with the patience of a stalking wolf. "How far now?" she asked, her voice low to keep the baby calm. "Closer," he said. "Tomorrow we reach my uncle's camp. They take us in. Strong fire, warm place. Women there will help." Sorella closed her eyes. The promise of other hands to help, of a roof, even a hide tent, felt like something stolen from a fairy tale she had long stopped believing. "Mato," her voice trembled. "What if they don't want us?" He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw a flicker of something fierce behind the calm mask he wore. "They will want her, and they will want you. My uncle is a good man. He knows the old ways. A child born under the winter moon carries strong medicine. And me?" she pressed. "What am I but a burden?" His mouth twitched at the corner, as if the question were a joke only he understood. "You are the mother of Dawn." He gestured at the baby's sleeping face. "That makes you more than all the burdens in this world." She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she bent her head and kissed the soft fuzz of Alba's hair, breathing in the scent of milk and hope and raw survival. They moved on when the wind threatened to scatter their meager warmth. Matu led them into the low hills where stunted cottonwoods bent under the weight of years and storms. The sky turned the color of old bruises, the first flakes of snow spinning down like ashes. Sorella's teeth chattered as the horse picked its way through drifts that had begun to gather in the gullies. She pressed Alba close, the baby's warmth a fragile shield against the wind that clawed at her face. They crested a rise near dusk, the world below unfolding in a hush of white and gray. Smoke drifted from a small cluster of lodges at the base of a distant hill, thin trails that wove into the darkening sky like threads of hope. Mato's breath misted in the cold. "There, my uncle's camp." Relief hit her like a blow, sudden and sharp enough to make her vision swim. She wanted to weep, but the tears froze before they could fall. They descended into the shallow valley as the last light bled out of the sky. Figures emerged from the shadows, men wrapped in buffalo hides, their breath ghosting around them. Mato stepped forward to greet them, speaking in quick, low Lakota that Sorella could only half catch. She watched from the saddle, arms locked tight around Alba. One of the men, a broad-shouldered elder with braids streaked white as snow, peered up at her, his eyes narrowing against the wind. Mato spoke again, louder this time. His voice carried the shape of her name, Sorella, and then the softer shape of Alba's, as if he were offering them like a prayer. The elder's eyes shifted to hers. He studied her for a long heartbeat, then turned and barked an order to the others. A woman stepped forward, tall, wrapped in a heavy robe trimmed in beads and fur. She reached up, hands gentle but strong, as she guided Sorella down from the horse. Sorella's knees nearly buckled. The woman caught her elbow, steadying her. In a voice softer than the wind, she spoke words Sorella didn't know but somehow understood. "You are safe now." Sorella looked past her to Mato. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his hand resting on the horse's neck as if he needed the touch to keep from drifting away in the rising storm. And in that moment, Sorella knew that the promise he had made back at Dry Creek was not just words whispered over a dying fire. He had carried her through the ghosts and the cold, and the teeth of men who would have gutted them for a scrap of hope. He had kept the fire alive. And tomorrow, whatever tomorrow brought, he would do it again. Alba stirred against her breast, her tiny fingers curling into the folds of her mother's tattered coat. Dawn was not far now. The wind died down by the time they stepped inside the elder's lodge, but the cold lingered, coiling like a serpent at the threshold. Sorella felt it bite her skin even as she crossed into warmth. Smoke from a small central fire stung her eyes. Its sweetness mixed with the smell of sage and dried hides.